Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Jimmy. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I have here my Fuji X-T2 and we're talking about a very important topic which is very divisive and full of drama and excitement, and that is the exposure compensation knob. Now some of you might be going, what is the big deal about that? Everyone has the exposure compensation knob. You turn it one way, your exposure gets bright. You turn it the other way, your exposure gets dark. Who cares? What is the big deal? Well, there's a lot of big deal about that, mister. So pay attention. I put a lot of work into this video, so just listen. I'm not going to yell at you, but hopefully this video can help you and inspire you to look further into this seemingly unassuming knob here called the exposure compensation knob. There are two camps when it comes to this knob. As I mentioned, it's a very polarizing knob because some people believe that there's no need for it. You should get rid of it. You should put something else in its place, Fuji, in your next XT, whatever may be coming up next. And I'm kind of in that camp. I never use it because I'm a manual shooter. And when you shoot in manual, you adjust exposure manually. Why do we need this? It makes no sense. Okay. The other side says, if you get rid of this Fuji, I swear I will never buy another camera from you ever. Okay, maybe they don't. I have read that though. They love this knob, right? They use it especially when they're shooting street photography and the environment changes from 1 second to the next. The sun hides behind the clouds or a building, and they're squatting down, taking a picture of someone's face. Well, they need to be able to move on the flick of a dime, and they need to be able to be flexible and not get bogged down with other variables when you shoot manual, right? So I get that, right? You don't want your momentum to be ruined. You want to keep shooting. And shooting automatic definitely does that for you. Okay, I understand that. Let's talk about what exposure compensation really is. When you take a picture of a scene, the light hits the camera and the lens and the sensor, and the camera does a computation. After all, it's a scientific instrument. It's not a creative instrument. We're the creative instrument that makes the scientific aspect work well for us. It does these algorithms, and then it says, this is the right exposure. Enjoy. Because we're an automatic exposure. Right? We're an aperture priority, full automatic or shutter speed priority. Usually that picture looks really good, but sometimes the picture can be off. You guys know exactly what I mean. When you take a picture of someone's face and there's a sun behind them, what happens to the face? It's completely underexposed. You can't even make out a nose on the person's face. Is that the correct exposure? Well, according to the computer, it is. But according to the creative mind, no, it's not the right exposure. So what can you do? You turn the exposure compensation knob a third of the way up or down, or to 3 full stops if you want to. So what are you doing? You're overriding what the camera thinks. The camera is automatically, because you're in automatic shooting mode, this is the right one, but you're telling it, no, it's not. I'm going to override it. And that's exactly what this knob is, and that's exactly how you should think about it. This is revolutionary because I thought of it. It's rare that I come up with anything independently, but unfortunately I read an article just now that was published way back when, and they used that term, an exposure override. Oh, that really grinds my gears, man. I thought of it first. But that's exactly what it is, okay? Credit whoever wrote that. Exposure override, that's what this is. And it just sounds cooler, am I right? The exposure override pushes the camera aside and says, you may be using the right algorithms, but I'm going to make it darker or brighter based on my taste and how I feel and what I want to see in my own picture. So, where can you really think about this? When you're taking a picture, let's say, of someone's face, and like I mentioned, it's really dark and really bright behind them, you can brighten the whole picture and override what the camera thinks, making their face brighter. Unfortunately, what can happen to the background? You got it. It can blow out the background. If you're shooting in RAW, it can recover the details in Lightroom or Photoshop. But if you're not into editing, just be aware you may have to cut out the background because it's too bright and distracting. Just my opinion. What is another example? You can take pictures in a dark subway and it's super dark. What would I do? I would move the exposure override after getting the results back and seeing it's way too dark. I can move it up, brightening the area. Now the camera sometimes will look in a really dark area and say, it's too dark, I'm going to brighten it, because it's doing the algorithm thing again, right? It's doing the computations. So I might take that bright picture and then bring it back down again. It's up to what you think looks good, how you want to override the automatic exposure. Same goes for shooting a very reflective area of all snow and glaciers, as I saw in this one other example. The camera might look at that really bright area and bring it down automatically if you're shooting an automatic exposure. So I will say, I want it brighter. So I'll go ahead and move it one way or the other, whichever way my tastes can sway me for that day. Now before we end this video, I think it's very important to go into a little bit more detail about what changes exactly, right, when you use the exposure override. Because if you're moving this knob, something is changing. What is it that makes it brighter or darker? Is it artificial? Is it some kind of ISO? I don't know. Well, I do know now that I've tried it out after a few days. So here we go. When you're on fully automatic exposure, AAA, the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, they're all on A, right? The camera's doing all the thinking for you. This is pretty much just a point and shoot camera at this point, like a cell phone. When you're doing this and you move the exposure compensation knob, try it out, right? It will actually juggle all of these variables and mess around with the ISO, the aperture, as well as the shutter speed to get a lighter exposure. Whatever it thinks it needs to do, depending on what you're pointing it at. Now, if you move the aperture off its A to, let's say, f2, f2.8, now it's on aperture priority. Meaning the aperture has been decided by you, the creative person, so the camera will now decide for the ISO and the shutter speed. When you move the exposure override, it will adjust the shutter to a point until it can't anymore, and then guess what's next after that to lighten or darken? The ISO. So it changes both of them, at least in my camera it does. If I move the aperture to A, to automatic, and move the time value to, let's say, 1/125, and I move the exposure compensation knob, and you can test this by holding down the exposure, it locks onto something, and then move the exposure compensation knob. Guess what changes? The aperture changes to a point to lighten or darken. It overrides the exposure it thinks is correct. And after a while it can't change anymore, it then changes the ISO. If you move both of these off the A's here, all three of these values, now you're in full manual mode. Does messing with the exposure override knob do anything in manual mode? No, it can't, because you're changing exposure on your own manually. This does not serve a purpose now. If you're a manual shooter like myself, it doesn't make you any better than a program shooter or aperture priority shooter. Not at all. If you're a semi-automatic exposure shooter and you use the exposure compensation knob, it does not make you better than a manual shooter. In fact, we should be persuaded to learn all aspects of our camera, automatic modes and manual modes. And that's kind of the whole point of this channel, so we can learn more together. And we invest so much into our cameras. Let's learn more about it and inspire each other together. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a little bit more about the exposure compensation knob or the exposure override. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.